Snow had already begun to fall over the east side when Della Whitmore knelt down on that red carpet, her swollen belly pressing against her thin coat, and gathered the last $42 she had in this world into the palm of a ragged stranger. She was 27, 7 months pregnant, and she'd been a widow since the winter her husband Aaron never came home from the job site. That money was supposed to buy the gas that would carry her to a doctor's appointment she couldn't afford to miss. She gave it away anyway, because she knew exactly what an empty stomach felt like, and she couldn't stand there, watching a starving man get dragged off like trash, while 300 well-dressed people looked the other way. "You need it more than I do," she whispered. And the man's cold, tired eyes lifted to meet hers. What Della didn't know, what nobody in that glittering hall could have guessed, was that the filthy coat and the days-old beard belonged to Cormac Vane, the man who quietly owned the docks, the freight lines, and half the ground they were standing on. A name every powerful man in this city lowered his voice to speak. He hadn't come to be pitied. He'd come to bury an old grief on the anniversary of a sister he couldn't save, and a stranger's kindness had just found the one crack in a heart he'd thought had turned to stone. Then Sylvia Renner, the polished woman running the whole charity, smiled for the cameras and ordered her guards to search the pregnant girl's bag, and when a sealed donation envelope she'd never seen appeared in her hands, the word thief tore across the room before a single phone stopped recording. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody asked how that envelope got there. And nobody in that room understood that the shivering beggar they'd just humiliated would remember every single face by morning. If this story's already found your heart, do it one small favor. Tap that like button, share it with someone who still believes kindness matters, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where it all began, 10 hours before that carpet, before the accusation, before everything fell apart. 10 hours before that red carpet, while the city was still asleep. Della Whitmore opened her eyes inside the old Buick parked out of sight behind the supermarket, where the warehouse lights cast a sickly, cold yellow glow over everything. Her breath had gathered into a thin veil of mist across the windshield, and the Ohio winter chill seeped through every rusted gap in the doors, slipping beneath the thin blanket she had wrapped around herself all night. She lay still for a moment, listening to the unborn baby stirring inside her, a gentle kick, as though the child were waking with its mother, and her hand instinctively moved to that place, soothing and protecting. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the cold. "You and Mommy have made it through another night." In the cramped car, heavy with the smell of cheap gasoline and old fabric, she sat up, tucked her hair behind her ear, then reached for the small tin box hidden beneath the driver's seat. It was her bank, everything she had left in this world. She opened the lid, poured the loose change and several crumpled bills into her palm, and began to count, slowly and carefully, the way she had always handled every number that had ever passed through her life. Enough for a little gas, enough to reach the prenatal clinic that afternoon, an appointment she had already postponed twice because she hadn't dared spend her last dollar. Enough, as long as she bought nothing for herself, as long as she skipped lunch the way she had skipped so many meals before. She divided the money into 2 portions, one for gas and one to keep in case of an emergency. And that simple act of separation, that precision, down to the final cent, was the last part of herself she still possessed, after everything else had been taken away. Della had once been a woman who worked with numbers. She understood them, trusted them, relied on them in a way she would never again dare to rely on people. "Numbers never lie to you," she murmured into the quiet cold, repeating a sentence she had said silently to herself thousands of times. "Only people teach them how to lie." Outside, a delivery truck roared to life and backed toward the loading dock, and Della flinched, pulling the blanket more tightly around herself, because she had learned that a woman sleeping in her car should never allow anyone to look at her for too long. She glanced into the rearview mirror and saw her own pale face, her gray eyes shadowed by restless nights, and her dark brown hair tied back neatly, even though there was no longer anyone for whom she needed to look presentable. She opened her purse and took out the old phone with a crack in the corner of the screen, the one thing she never allowed to run out of power. And every morning, before stepping into another day, she played Aaron's final recording so their unborn child could hear the voice of the father it would never meet. She let it play for only a few seconds, just long enough to hear him laugh, then stopped it and tucked the rest away the way someone might save the last piece of bread for the hungriest days. That morning, she sat in silence for a while, gazing across the empty parking lot, where a few dry leaves curled and tumbled in the wind. And she allowed herself to dream, for only a moment, of a room with a fireplace, a crib, and a morning when she wouldn't have to count every coin before deciding whether she could afford to eat. Then she pushed the dream aside, as she always did, because dreams were a luxury a woman in her circumstances couldn't afford. There was work to be done today. Today was the day the Harvest Table organization was holding its grand gala, and she had heard they were hiring again for an accounting position, the very kind of work she used to do, the one thing she had always done best. She would go there. She would submit an application, demand the wages her former contractor still owed her, and perhaps, if fortune showed her even the smallest kindness, she would find the right person to receive what she had been keeping for so long. She fastened her thin coat tight against the chill, drew a deep breath of the bitterly cold air, and spoke to her child with every trace of tenderness still left inside her chest. Today, you and Mommy are going to try, all right? Just one more day. She had no idea that this day would take more from her than all the days before it combined, and that this same day, upon a red carpet surrounded by people who turned their faces away, would place into her hands a destiny she had never dared to dream of. There were mornings like this, when the cold tightened around her chest and loneliness rose inside her like a tide, when Della let her heart drift back to the year her life had still been whole, the year when she still had Aaron. He was a welder, his hands always carrying the scent of metal and sparks, his skin browned by long days spent high above the ground on towering scaffolds, and his smile, that smile that made her forget every trace of exhaustion whenever he stepped through the doorway of the small apartment they rented on the edge of the city. They weren't rich, had never been rich, but they had each other, and to Della back then, that had felt like an entire fortune. She could still remember with perfect clarity the evening she held the pregnancy test in her hand and ran trembling to show him, and the way he lifted her off the floor and spun her around their cramped kitchen, laughing so loudly that the neighbors had to pound on the wall. He had pressed his ear against her stomach even though there was nothing yet to hear, whispering promises to a life that hadn't even taken shape, promising that he would work harder, save more, and give their child a real home with a small yard where they could run and play. He was certain the baby would be a boy, while she stubbornly insisted it would be a girl, and they had argued joyfully about it for several nights, choosing names, imagining the child's face, drawing an entire future in their minds that they believed without question would come. But that future lasted exactly 1 week, because the same week she learned she was pregnant was also the week Aaron never came home from the construction site. She still remembered the knock on the door that day, the foreman's bloodless face, and the way the words fell from his mouth while she stood there unable to piece them together into any meaning she could bear. An accident, they said. A fall. Then, when she forced herself to stand again after those first numb days, when she went to the company and asked what responsibility they would take for the husband who had died while working for them, all she received were 2 cold words wrapped inside documents stamped in red: personal negligence. They said he had been careless. They said the fault was his. They said it with a calmness so cruel that it seemed a human life could be erased by one carefully chosen phrase, and that they owed her nothing, owed nothing to the child growing inside her, not even a single dollar. She had stood there with one hand cradling her belly, and for the first time in her life, she understood that some people were willing to rewrite the truth, simply to avoid paying the price for it. After that came the long downward slide, the mounting medical bills, the apartment she had to give up because she could no longer afford the rent, and finally the old Buick becoming the only home she and her baby had left. The doctor at the free clinic, a woman with kind eyes, had told her to protect her health, to eat properly, and to avoid the kind of worry that could harm both her and the baby. And Della had nodded and smiled, hiding the truth that she didn't know where her next meal would come from. Yet through all those losses, there was one thing Della still held on to, tightly and carefully, the way someone might protect a seed through winter. It was an old, thick file, wrapped in layers of plastic and hidden beneath a suitcase filled with baby clothes, documents she had copied during the brief time she worked as an accountant for the Harvest Table organization itself. At the time, she hadn't fully understood everything she was seeing. She only knew that the numbers didn't match, that the number of meals recorded in the books was far greater than the number that actually reached the hungry people in the East Side neighborhood, and that something rotten was hidden beneath the polished appearance of charity. She had spoken up, and not long afterward she lost her job, a coincidence she knew wasn't a coincidence at all. People advised her to forget what she had seen, to destroy every document so she could stay safe. But Della didn't destroy them. She held her belly, looked down at the file in her hands, and told herself that she was keeping it not because she wanted to cling to the past or feed her anger, but for a reason far simpler than that. She kept it because deep in her heart, she believed there would come a day, someday, when someone would need to see the truth hidden within those numbers. And when that day came, she wanted to still have it, whole and undeniable, like the final testimony for everyone who had been left behind. That same morning, in a place far removed from Della's world, inside a room on the highest floor of a glass-clad tower overlooking the harbor, a man stood silently beside the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed down at the ships and the rows of containers stacked like a colossal chessboard whose rules only he understood. Cormac Vane never raised his voice, nor did he ever need to, because in this city, his silence made people tremble more than any threat could. Though only in his early 30s, he already controlled an entire network of docks, shipping routes, and countless business operations that most people dared mention only in whispers. That morning, another man sat in a chair at the center of the room, sweat gathering at his temples despite the cool air, his hands locked together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His name was Doyle, one link in the chain that managed the flow of goods and money moving through the Harvest Table charity, and one of the men Cormac had once trusted to oversee it. Cormac turned around, his gaze so calm that it was terrifying, without anger, without a raised voice, only a deep and merciless coldness that made Doyle lower his head and refuse to look up. "I once believed you were a grateful man," Cormac said, his voice steady, each word falling slowly like drops of freezing water. "I pulled you out of the mud when no one else would even look at you. I gave you a place in this world, a roof over your head, and a chance to live an honorable life. And I gave you a way out, Doyle. Even after I knew your numbers had begun to stink, I gave you the chance to tell me the truth." He stepped closer and lowered himself until his eyes were level with the trembling man's. "But you chose to lie to me. You looked me directly in the eye and lied." Doyle opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came out, because they both understood that it was far too late for explanations. Cormac straightened, gave the slightest tilt of his head, and the two broad-shouldered men standing by the door moved forward in silence, escorting Doyle away without another sound. There was no public display of violence, no blood, only the absolute finality of a power that didn't need noise to prove itself. When the door closed, only Cormac and Silas Okonkwo remained, his most loyal right-hand man, a tall, imposing figure with a composed face and eyes that missed nothing. Silas stepped forward and placed a thin file on the desk. Doyle was only the man who held out his hands to collect. "Sir," Silas said quietly, "he isn't intelligent enough to have conceived all of this. The money moving through Harvest Table has been systematically drained year after year, and it has been concealed far too skillfully to be the work of an amateur. There's someone on the inside, someone seated high enough to see every number and clever enough to alter them before they ever reach you." Cormac said nothing, his gaze still fixed on the harbor below. Silas hesitated for a moment, then continued, choosing each word with care, as though he knew he was approaching something dangerous. "Sir, the person at the head of that organization, the person controlling its entire public face, was personally elevated by you. You were the one who placed that person in that position." Cormac turned sharply, and for the first time that morning, a blade of cold light flashed in his eyes. "If you're about to say what I think you're about to say, then stop right there, Silas," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I don't choose the wrong people. I watched that person for years. That loyalty was tested through trials that would have broken anyone else long ago. The one betraying me can't be someone I raised with my own hands." Silas lowered his head and didn't argue further, because he understood that some truths required time before a man could accept them, even when that man was Cormac Vane. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither of them had spoken. Then Cormac looked toward the calendar hanging on the wall, and something in his face changed. The hard expression of a crime lord cracked for the briefest moment, revealing a grief he had hidden for years. Today marked the anniversary of Nora's death, the younger sister he hadn't been able to save, and every year on this day, he did something no one in his empire could understand. "Prepare the car to take me down to East Side," he said, his voice gentler now. Silas looked up in surprise. "Sir, dressed like this? Let me arrange for someone to accompany you." But Cormac had already removed his expensive coat and pulled on an old, worn jacket. He hadn't shaved in several days, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city looked no different from an exhausted wanderer. "No one is necessary," he replied. "Today, I want to go alone." There are places where my power means nothing, and that is exactly where I need to be. The car dropped Cormac off at the edge of East Side, then quietly drove away, leaving the man in the old, worn coat standing alone among the streets where he had grown up, streets that were still every bit as poor as they had been when he was a hungry barefoot boy running across cracked sidewalks. He slipped both hands into his coat pockets, lowered his head, and walked slowly past shuttered shops, stained walls, and sagging awnings, each step carrying him deeper into a realm of memory that even an empire could never fill. On that corner had once stood the grocery store where he stole bread. In that alley, he had learned that the world showed no kindness to those who had nothing. And somewhere among those rows of gray buildings lingered the shadow of Nora, the younger sister whose image kept appearing and fading like breath in the cold, a pain he had carried all his life and dared to touch only once each year, on this exact day. He didn't cry, because he had forgotten how to cry long ago, but with every step, the weight inside his chest grew heavier. At the same time, not far away, Della Whitmore was following the address that led to the place where the Harvest Table organization had arranged its grand gala, and when she arrived, she stopped short before the bitter contrast spread out before her eyes. They had built a magnificent reception hall in the very heart of the impoverished neighborhood, with a long red carpet, glittering chandeliers, flower arrangements taller than a person, and at the front entrance, elegantly dressed guests streamed inside beneath the glare of cameras, wearing carefully practiced smiles and exchanging carefully staged handshakes. But when Della made her way around to the back, she saw something entirely different. A side entrance where the ragged people of East Side itself stood in line beneath a flimsy awning, shivering in the cold, clutching empty bags and hoping to receive something from the charity being so loudly celebrated inside. 2 doors for a single event, she thought. One for those displayed before the cameras, and one for those hidden away in the darkness, and the thought awakened everything she had witnessed during the time she had worked for them. Della drew a deep breath, clutching her thin coat tightly around herself to steady her nerves, then walked toward the main entrance, because she had come there that day with 2 separate purposes clearly fixed in her mind. First, she would openly apply for the accounting position she had heard they were filling again, and she would demand an answer about the wages her former contractor still owed her, a legitimate and reasonable explanation for her presence, a cover no one could challenge. But beneath that lay a second purpose, one she carried far more cautiously. Inside her purse, carefully wrapped in plastic, was the file of records she had protected for so long, and she hoped, only hoped, that somewhere among that crowd of powerful people, she might find someone with enough authority, a major donor, an advisory board member, someone beyond Sylvia Renner's influence, into whose hands she could quietly place the truth she had preserved. She knew she couldn't give it to the very people who had built the deception, so she had to find the right person, and she would wait for the right moment. As she moved through the crowd, Della's gaze accidentally drifted toward the loading area along the side of the building, where refrigerated trucks were backing into place, and memory rushed over her again, this time bringing the image of Eddie, the driver she had once worked with during her days there. She remembered the gentle unease on his face whenever the shipment totals on paper didn't match what was actually loaded onto the trucks, and the way he would look at her as though he wanted to say something, only to swallow it again out of fear, because like her, he was merely a small, powerless person trying to hold on to his job. She wondered what had become of Eddie, whether he was still driving for them, whether he still remembered what the 2 of them had seen, but she had no time to dwell on it, because she had nearly reached the front entrance. She straightened her collar, lifted her head, and tried to carry herself with as much dignity as she could in her worn clothes. She hadn't yet reached the steps, hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't accomplished even one of the 2 things she had planned, when an angry shout rang out from the front and sent a stir through the crowd. Della looked up, and her heart suddenly tightened when she saw 2 security guards roughly shoving a ragged man away from the entrance. In that instant, every plan she had made disappeared, because there were some things a person like her could never stand by and pretend not to see. Della pushed through the crowd, forgetting the heavy weight of her belly and the exhaustion that had settled into every part of her body, seeing only one of the 2 security guards shove the ragged man hard in the shoulder and send him stumbling, nearly knocking him to the ground. "Go somewhere else, you filthy old man," the guard snarled. "This place isn't meant for people like you." The man didn't answer. He merely straightened himself slowly, and something about the way he stood made Della hesitate for the briefest moment, a strange composure that didn't belong with his disheveled appearance. But she had no time to think about it, because anger was already rising inside her chest. "Why are you pushing him like that?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. The guard turned toward her and looked her up and down, from her thin coat to her pregnant belly, then gave a contemptuous laugh. "Mind your own business, miss. He's disturbing our distinguished guests." Della didn't step back. "He's only standing here. Isn't this supposed to be a charity event? Isn't everything you've built here meant to help people like him?" Their exchange began drawing attention. Several phones were raised, and at that moment, a woman in a magnificent emerald gown separated herself from the crowd and approached, her heels striking the pavement with sharp, cold precision. It was Sylvia Renner, the public face of the entire organization. Her smile already prepared for the cameras, even though her eyes were as cold as ice. She looked at Della, then at the ragged man, and a calculating smile of false pity appeared on her lips. "What is all this commotion?" Sylvia asked, her voice sweet but cutting. "Oh, I see. Another person who believes charity means we must cast aside every trace of dignity and allow just anyone to force their way into our event." Her gaze settled on Della's belly and her worn clothing, and the contempt in her smile deepened. "What are you doing here, young woman? Have you come to beg for food, or to cause trouble in front of our donors?" Della felt heat rush into her cheeks, but she didn't lower her head. "I came to apply for a job and to ask about the wages I'm still owed, but that has nothing to do with why you're treating a hungry human being as though he were garbage." Sylvia raised one eyebrow, then let out a soft laugh, the kind of laugh that belonged to someone utterly certain that all power rested in her hands. "The desperate always seem to believe the whole world owes them an apology," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, and several elegantly dressed guests joined in with mocking laughter. The words struck like a knife, but they didn't make Della collapse. Instead, they made her turn toward the ragged man standing in silence, and in his weary eyes she saw something that caused her heart to ache. Not a plea for help, but a loneliness so deep that she understood it all too well. He hasn't eaten anything, she thought, and in the food distribution area behind the building, the workers had already begun packing everything away even though night had not yet fallen. Without another thought, Della opened her purse, and what happened next became the moment captured by dozens of phones. The moment when a woman who had nothing left gave away everything she had. The man lifted his head and looked at her, and deep within those cold, unyielding eyes, something fractured, a crack that years of power and solitude had never been able to reach, because the unconditional kindness of someone who was herself destitute had awakened a pain he believed he had buried long ago. But Sylvia Renner didn't see it, or if she did, she chose to turn it into an opportunity. The smile vanished from her lips, and she leaned slightly toward a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit standing nearby. Bruno Kessler, the head of security, whispering a few brief words into his ear that Della couldn't hear. Only a few seconds later, Bruno stepped forward, and before Della could understand what was happening, he tore the purse from her shoulder, searched through it, then pulled out something she had never seen before in her life, a donation envelope that was still completely sealed. Then Sylvia's voice rang out, shrill and triumphant, tearing through the air, as she called Della a thief before dozens of cameras aimed directly at her, exactly as it had happened on that fateful red carpet. In the middle of the chaos, as two guards seized her arms and dragged her away, Della still managed to see the ragged man standing perfectly still. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a beggar, but those of a man committing every face to memory. And from a distance, he also saw Sylvia quietly signal to an employee beside the camera system, who discreetly removed a memory card and slipped it into his coat pocket. That night, the snow fell more heavily, covering the empty parking lot in white, where Della's old Buick huddled like a wounded animal, and inside that freezing car, the young woman sat in silence, hugging her knees against her chest as though trying to hold herself together. She had driven away from that place of horror until the fuel gauge dropped to empty, until the engine coughed several times and died, and now she was stranded in the darkness with a dry gas tank, an empty wallet, and a name that had been smeared before thousands of unfamiliar eyes. The cold seeped into every fiber of her body, but she no longer had the strength to shiver. Her entire body felt drained, as though every final drop of energy had been wrung from her, and a vague dizziness kept rising and fading behind her temples. She knew she needed food, needed rest, needed everything the doctor had told her to have, but she had nothing in her hands except darkness and white snow. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks without a single sob, because she had learned long ago that crying aloud only made the pain heavier without changing anything. She bent forward, burying her face in her hands, And when she spoke to her unborn child, her voice broke, but she didn't surrender. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she whispered into the darkness. "I promised you so many things. A home, a crib, a warm morning. And yet I still haven't given you anything except this cold, this old car, and now, even a name people are calling a thief." She paused, swallowed the ache caught in her throat, then continued, and this time there was something stronger in her voice, a vow spoken from the very depths of her heart. "But listen to me. I promise you, with everything I have left, that I'll clear that name before you ever see this world. You won't have to grow up with a mother people call a thief. I'll prove the truth, no matter what price I have to pay." The baby inside her gave a gentle kick, as though it had heard her, as though it believed her, and Della let out a small laugh through her tears, placing her freezing hand over the place where she had felt the movement. She remained like that for a long while in the vast silence of the snowy night, until she could no longer bear the weight of her loneliness, and her hand searched for the old phone inside her bag. Her trembling finger moved across the cracked screen and opened the recording she always saved for the darkest moments. The voice of Aaron, the man who had loved her, made promises to her, and left this world far too soon. She pressed play and held the phone close to her belly so their child could hear its father's voice. And inside the freezing car came a warm voice that belonged to the past, slightly distorted by time but still filled with love. "I don't know what I ever did to deserve you and our baby," Aaron's voice said softly. "But I promise both of you that no matter what happens, I'll always be watching over you." Della stopped the recording there, not daring to listen any further, because the rest was more than she could bear that night, and she held the phone against her chest as though she were holding the man himself. The tears came again, but this time they carried something different. Not only pain, but strength, because she knew she wasn't allowed to collapse. Not now. Not while a tiny life depended entirely on her. She pulled the thin blanket tightly around herself, placed both hands over her belly, and in the skin-cutting cold of that Ohio night, the young woman closed her eyes and whispered her promise once more into the darkness. A promise she had no idea would carry her farther than she could ever have imagined. By the following morning, when Della opened her eyes in the lingering cold left behind by the snowy night, she had no idea that the world beyond her old car had changed completely, and not in any way that favored her. Her phone, cracked at one corner, vibrated again and again with unfamiliar notifications, and when she opened them, her heart seemed to stop, because there on the screen was her own face, recorded and edited with a precision so cruel it felt deliberate. The video had spread across social media overnight, but it didn't tell the truth. It told only the story people wanted to tell. It began at the exact moment Bruno pulled the envelope from her purse, cutting out every trace of her defending the ragged man, giving away her last money, and having her bag torn from her shoulder by the guard. In that video, she appeared to be a thief caught in the act, a pregnant woman exploiting charity for her own gain, while Sylvia's voice rang out clearly, filled with righteous outrage, accusing her of stealing before the entire world. Beneath it were thousands of comments, and Della couldn't stop reading them, even though every line felt like a needle piercing her heart. People called her a disgrace to society. They said she should be sent to prison. They mocked her by saying that even her unborn child was about to have a thief for a mother. Not one person among those thousands stopped to ask how the envelope had found its way into her purse. Not one wondered why a woman preparing to become a mother would steal in broad daylight beneath the gaze of dozens of cameras. The truth didn't matter to them. Only the story mattered, and that story had already been written with her cast as the guilty one. Della forced herself to stand, reminding herself that she still had things to do, that she couldn't allow the video to destroy her, and she decided to find her former contractor and demand the wages they still owed her, money that rightfully belonged to her, money that might help her survive the days ahead. But when she arrived, the manager looked at her with cold, unfamiliar eyes, and before she could even finish speaking, he waved her away. "We don't owe anything to a troublemaker like you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do you think we haven't seen that video? Do you think we want anything to do with someone like you? Leave before I call security." Della stood there in stunned silence, and in that moment, such a powerful knot of anguish rose in her throat that she could barely breathe, because the irony was almost unbearably cruel. She was the woman who had always kept every number honest, who had spoken out when she saw wrongdoing even though she knew it would cost her the job, who had never taken a single cent that didn't belong to her, and now the whole world was calling her a thief. Her honesty had driven her to this desperate place, and now the accusation she had never deserved was taking away her final chance to survive. She dragged herself back toward the car, And along the way, her phone rang again, this time with an incoming call. When she saw the name on the screen, a fragile spark of hope flickered inside her, because it was Aaron's mother, the only family she had left in the world, the woman Della had quietly regarded as her last remaining source of support. She answered, her voice choked with emotion. "Mom," but there was none of the warmth she longed for on the other end, only a hesitant coldness that made her heart sink. "Della," the woman said heavily, "I saw the video. The entire neighborhood has seen it. The neighbors look at me and whisper behind my back. I can't endure any more of this." Della tightened her grip on the phone. "Mom, I swear to you, I didn't do it. They set me up. You have to believe me." But the woman only sighed, a sigh carrying all the exhaustion and shame of someone who didn't have the strength to believe. "Please, don't call me again. I can't carry this disgrace any longer. Just leave me alone." Then the line went dead, leaving Della standing alone in the freezing street, the phone still pressed to her ear as she listened to the hollow sound of absolute loneliness. She had lost everything, her work, her dignity, and now even her final source of comfort. But when she placed a hand over her belly and felt a gentle kick from within, she drew a deep breath, wiped away her tears, and told herself that even if the whole world turned its back on her, she still had one reason to remain standing, and for that tiny reason, she wouldn't allow herself to fall. 2 days later, while Della sat inside the car trying to warm her hands with her own breath, a call came from an unfamiliar number, and the woman's voice on the other end was so sweet that it immediately put her on guard. The woman introduced herself as a mediator, saying that she represented the parties involved and wanted to bring the matter to a quiet and peaceful conclusion, and that if Della agreed to cooperate, everything could be resolved quickly and neatly for everyone. "We understand your situation," the smooth voice said. "A single mother, close to giving birth, with nowhere to turn. We don't want to drive you into a corner. All you have to do is sign a statement acknowledging that there was an unfortunate misunderstanding, that you accidentally took the envelope, and there will be money set aside for you, enough to care for your baby, enough to begin again somewhere else." Della listened, and in one weak moment, she thought about that money, about a hot meal, about a roof over her child's head. But then she remembered the promise she had made in the snowy night, remembered the truth she had protected for so long, and she understood that signing that paper would mean carrying the name of a thief forever, that her child would grow up beneath a lie sealed with an official stamp. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't take anything by mistake, and I won't sign a lie. You can take everything from me, but you can't buy the truth." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then the sweetness in the woman's voice turned suddenly cold. "You're making a serious mistake, Miss Whitmore. Think carefully, because your circumstances can become much worse." Then the call ended, leaving Della with a chilling uneasiness, a feeling that this wasn't their final blow. She was right. The next morning, while she was out looking for work, a stranger quietly approached her old Buick, and during that brief window of time, a small object was hidden in the most sacred place inside her car. In the bag of newborn clothes she had lovingly protected for her unborn child, a glittering, expensive diamond ring that belonged to a world completely foreign to her poverty. At the same time, somewhere else, Sylvia Renner reported to the police that a valuable ring had been stolen, and with an air of righteous concern, she suggested that the woman from the viral theft video was very likely responsible, because anyone bold enough to take an envelope would have little difficulty taking a ring as well. With the video already spread everywhere as supposed proof of Della's character, the police had enough reason to follow the trail, and by that very afternoon, when Della returned to her car, they were waiting with a search warrant. She stood frozen as they searched the last shelter she had left, and when an officer pulled the diamond ring from the bag of baby clothes, her entire world seemed to collapse. "I've never seen that before in my life," she said, her voice trembling as she clasped her frozen hands together. "Someone put it there. Please, you have to believe me." But her words disappeared into empty air, and she was taken to the station for questioning. A woman 7 months pregnant, sitting in a cold room beneath harsh white lights, facing a relentless stream of questions. Time passed, and Della began to feel the room spinning around her, sharp throbs pulsing behind both temples, while a crushing exhaustion spread through her body and forced her to grip the edge of the table just to remain conscious. "Could I please have a glass of water?" she said softly, steadying herself against the edge of the table as though trying to calm the baby moving inside her. "Please, I don't feel well." One of the officers reluctantly brought her water, and as she took small sips to steady herself, Her eyes accidentally settled on the diamond ring resting inside the evidence bag on the table. In that moment, even through exhaustion and panic, the trained eye of the accountant within her still noticed something unusual, something no one else in that room had seen. There was a tiny mark engraved inside the band, a faint symbol, and it didn't match what should have appeared on a piece of jewelry described the way that woman had claimed. Della didn't immediately understand what it meant, because her thoughts were too scattered to reason clearly, but a quiet corner of her mind stored the detail away, preserving it with the sharp precision that had defined her entire career as an accountant. Just as Della felt she couldn't endure one more question, while the officers continued pressing her again and again, the interrogation room door suddenly opened, and a middle-aged woman stepped inside with the calm bearing of someone far too familiar with rooms like this one. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair neatly pinned back, and her face carried the patience of a person who had heard too many lies to be shaken by anything. "From this moment forward, you will not ask my client another question unless I am present," she said, never raising her voice, yet every word carried weight, and she placed her business card on the table. She was Marlene Frost, an attorney from the Community Legal Aid Center, who had heard about Della's case and come to help her. She sat beside Della, glanced at the young woman's pale, exhausted face, then turned toward the officers with a series of questions so sharp that they began to stumble over their answers. She asked whether they had any direct evidence proving that her client had taken the ring, or whether their entire case rested on one person's statement and a video that had clearly been edited. She pointed out that finding an object inside an unsecured vehicle, a car anyone could have approached, didn't prove that its owner had placed it there. She spoke about the rights of a pregnant woman, about her client's health, and about the danger that prolonged questioning could cause. Each of her words seemed like another brick laid carefully into place, solid and impossible to move, until the officers were forced to yield. Della was released that same afternoon, even though the case remained open and the cloud of suspicion still hung above her. When the two women stepped out of the police station, Marlene stopped on the steps, looked directly into Della's eyes, and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "Listen to me, young woman. I know you're angry. I know you're frightened. I know you want to scream to the entire world that you're innocent. But we aren't going to do that. We don't shout. We document. Anger cools. Words disappear. But paper outlives anger, and a truth recorded carefully will still be there when all the noise has faded away." She taught Della how to write down every point in the timeline, every event, every detail with absolute precision, when the purse left her shoulder, who had been standing nearby, and what each person had said. She told her to think about whether there were any cameras near the parking lot, at a drugstore, a gas station, or anywhere else that might have accidentally captured the person who had slipped into her car. And when Della, while recounting everything that had happened, mentioned the strange detail she had noticed inside the ring, the faint engraving that didn't match, Marlene suddenly stopped writing and looked up at her with an unusually sharp expression. "Are you certain? You saw the symbol clearly?" she asked. And when Della nodded, Marlene wrote it down with great care and underlined it several times. "If what you're saying is true," she said softly, almost to herself, "then this could be the key to everything. Because a detail like that tells me something very important. This ring doesn't belong to the person who reported it missing. And once we prove that, their entire story will begin to collapse." For the first time, after so many dark days, Della felt a fragile spark of hope rise inside her. That afternoon, as she dragged herself back toward her car, exhausted and faint with hunger, a woman selling food by the roadside suddenly called out to her. The woman had seen her, perhaps recognized her from the video, but instead of looking at her with contempt, she quietly placed a container of hot food into Della's hands. Della hesitated and tried to refuse, but the woman only smiled gently and said, "Take it, sweetheart. Today it's your turn to receive. Tomorrow it may be mine." And in that small moment, amid all the cruelty of the world, Della suddenly realized that kindness still existed somewhere, quiet and asking for nothing, just like the kindness she had given away on that fateful red carpet. Late that afternoon, while Della sat beside her car, opening the still warm container of food the street vendor had given her, a familiar figure appeared at the far end of the parking lot, and her heart began to beat a little faster when she realized it was the same ragged man to whom she had given her last money. He approached in the same worn coat, with the same rough beard and slow, measured stride, and Della had no idea that behind that disheveled appearance, Cormac Vane was fighting a fierce struggle within himself. He had returned for a reason he could barely admit, even to himself, because he felt indebted to this woman. Indebted because disaster had fallen upon her simply because she had shown him kindness. He wanted to understand who she was, wanted to know what would become of her, but he still couldn't reveal his true identity, because he understood two things clearly. First, if she learned who he truly was, a woman who valued honesty as deeply as she did would surely be horrified and reject any help offered by a man like him. Second, if he revealed himself too soon, Sylvia would immediately sense that he was investigating her, and every piece of evidence she was hiding would disappear in an instant. So he continued playing the part of a wanderer, even though every moment of it weighed heavily on his heart. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse. Della looked up, and although her mind was still crowded with worry, she shifted aside and held the food container toward him. "Would you like something to eat? Someone gave me this, and there's a lot. I can't finish it by myself." Cormac paused for a moment, because he hadn't expected a woman who had just lost everything to still be willing to share her meager meal with a stranger. He sat beside her and accepted a portion of the food, and while the two of them ate quietly in the cold light of late afternoon, Della began to study him, and something about him left her puzzled. She noticed his hands. Though they were smudged with dirt, his fingernails were far too clean for a man who lived on the streets, and the skin of his hands wasn't hardened in the way years of hunger and hardship usually left behind. She realized that his voice was too calm, too controlled, like the voice of a man accustomed to giving orders rather than begging for mercy. And when a refrigerated truck roared as it backed into a nearby loading dock, making such a loud noise that even she flinched, the man beside her didn't react at all, didn't shrink away with the instinct of someone who had spent his life constantly afraid on the streets. She said nothing, but the part of her trained to notice details that didn't fit quietly stored every one of them away, arranging them into a question she wasn't yet ready to answer. She wasn't certain of anything. It was only a faint feeling that this man wasn't what he appeared to be. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice gentle but her eyes searching. Cormac stopped chewing for a moment, then answered, "People call me Cor." It was half a truth, a shortened name offered as an evasion, and at that very moment, Silas's voice came through the concealed earpiece with a warning, reminding him to be careful, telling him that this woman was sharper than he had expected, and that he was walking along a dangerous line. Della nodded and didn't ask anything more, but she didn't miss the brief hesitation before he answered. They sat together for a while longer, and Della, perhaps because she wanted to break the silence, perhaps because she wanted to learn more about this mysterious man, began telling him a little about her former work, about the days when she had been an accountant, and about her belief that everything had to be recorded clearly and openly. "You know," she said, her gaze drifting into the distance, "I've seen many people do charitable work with open hands, but never bother to record a single number. And I learned something. Kindness without records will eventually become theft, because when no one is counting, people find it very easy to give themselves permission to take what belongs to someone else." Cormac listened in silence, and something deep inside him was shaken, because the suffering woman sitting beside him had just spoken the very truth that his entire empire had failed to see for years. The stillness of late afternoon was broken when two unfamiliar figures appeared at the far end of the parking lot, two broad-shouldered men in dark coats approaching with an unmistakably threatening stride, and from the look in their eyes alone, Della knew they hadn't come by accident. "Miss Whitmore," one of them said in a cold voice, "we were sent to remind you of something. Certain people are losing patience with your stubbornness. You were given a chance to sign the papers and disappear, but you refused. That was a foolish choice." Della sprang to her feet, and her maternal instinct made her step backward and wrap both arms around her belly, protecting the child inside. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling even as she struggled to remain steady. The man came closer, and without warning, he seized her arm roughly and yanked hard, making her stumble and nearly fall onto the frozen ground. A wave of absolute terror rose inside Della, not fear for herself, but fear for the tiny life that depended entirely on her, and she let out a choked cry, pressing her hands tightly over her belly. But in the very next instant, before the man could do anything more, a hand caught his wrist and twisted it backward with such strength and precision that he screamed in pain. The ragged man had risen without her noticing, and now every trace of his slow, disheveled manner had vanished, replaced by movements so decisive, cold, and astonishingly skilled that Della could barely believe what she was seeing. He turned, used the man's own momentum to throw him face down onto the ground. Then, when the second man charged, He stepped aside with the speed of someone who had been trained through countless confrontations, locked the man's arm behind his back, and forced him down with only a few clean movements. No struggle had any chance of succeeding, and not a single strike was wasted. This wasn't the panicked resistance of a homeless man defending himself, but the cold mastery of someone accustomed to giving orders, maintaining control, and making others submit beneath his authority. "Get out of here," he said, his voice low but carrying a force that drained the color from both men's faces. "And tell whoever sent you that this woman is protected. If you ever dare come near her again, you'll regret it." The two men scrambled to their feet, staring at him with a mixture of shock and fear, then hurried out of the parking lot without daring to look back. Della stood there with one hand still cradling her belly, her heart pounding, and she looked at the man before her with an entirely different feeling now. It was no longer a vague suspicion, but something close to certainty. No homeless man could bring down two hired thugs within seconds with such calmness and skill. This man, the one to whom she had given her last money, the one who called himself Core, was certainly not what he appeared to be. He was a man of power, someone who had once held the lives of others in his hands, and now he was hiding that truth beneath a torn coat for a reason she couldn't yet understand. But true to her nature, Della didn't voice the question burning inside her mind. She didn't expose him or demand answers. She merely watched him in silence, remembered everything, and decided to keep observing, because she had learned that sometimes silence and patience revealed far more truth than hurried accusations ever could. "You saved me," she said softly. "Thank you." Cormac looked at her, and something in his eyes softened even as it remained guarded. "There are people who don't want you to find the truth," he said, choosing each word carefully. "I know something about people like that, that's all." It was a confession of sorts, but also a concealment, and both of them understood that something unspoken now existed between them. A few days later, while Della was helping Marlene organize her notes, her old phone received a brief, cautious message from an unfamiliar number, sent by someone who claimed to have seen the video and could no longer live with turning away in silence. The person gave no name, only asked to meet her at an old repair garage on the edge of the city, where the noise of machinery could conceal a conversation, and instructed her to bring her attorney. Marlene was wary at first, concerned that it might be another trap, but Della's instincts told her that this time was different, and when the two women arrived at the meeting place, the man waiting for them in the shadows of the garage made her heart tighten with emotion. It was Eddie, the gentle driver she still remembered, the man with the weathered face and eyes that had always carried a trace of troubled sympathy. He had aged considerably since the last time she saw him, and now his eyes bore an even deeper burden of guilt. "I saw that video, Della," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know you aren't a thief. I know better than anyone, because for all these years, I've driven the shipments you used to record, and I've seen how the numbers were distorted." He pulled a carefully folded stack of papers from inside his coat, shipping records, printed messages, ordering him to change delivery routes after the trucks had already left the warehouse, evidence showing that relief supplies meant for the poor had been redirected somewhere else. "They sent me messages telling me to change the route and keep quiet," he said. "And I stayed quiet because I was afraid, because I needed this job to support my family. But when I saw them blame you, a pregnant woman, I couldn't live with myself anymore." Marlene took the documents, her eyes lighting with interest. But what left both her and Eddie stunned came immediately afterward, when Della quietly opened her purse and removed the thick file she had wrapped carefully and protected for so long. She spread the papers across the grease-stained wooden table in the garage, pages yellowed with age, and the other two stared at her in open amazement. "I've kept these since I worked for them," Della said calmly. "The numbers that didn't match, the records I copied before they fired me. For the past few months, I've been waiting for the right moment, for someone who needed to see them." Marlene looked at her, then down at the documents fitting together perfectly, what Eddie had brought and what Della had preserved, two halves of the same picture now forming an undeniable whole. The woman the entire world had believed to be a helpless victim, a broken soul being crushed beneath forces beyond her control, had actually held half the truth from the very beginning, waiting quietly and patiently. But when Marlene began explaining that Eddie would need to testify, that his statement could prove decisive, the driver's face suddenly darkened with fear. He looked down at his calloused hands, and his voice fell. "I have a family. I have children," he stammered. "These people can destroy me. They can destroy my whole family. Give me some time to think, all right? I need time." And Della, though she herself was barely holding on above the edge of an abyss. Though his testimony might have been the lifeline that saved her, placed a hand on his shoulder with genuine compassion. "Eddie, don't destroy yourself just to prove that I'm innocent," she said gently. "You've already been braver than so many others by bringing these things to me. If you aren't ready, I understand. We'll find another way." Eddie looked at her with eyes filled with gratitude and shame, then nodded quietly, promised he would contact her again, and walked out of the garage, disappearing into the fading afternoon light. But when the next day passed, and then the day after that, without a single message from him, the spark of hope that had just begun to glow inside Della dimmed once more, fading like a candle on the verge of going out. That night, Cormac returned to a hidden corner of Eastside, a place he visited only once each year, a narrow alley behind a row of aging buildings where time seemed to have stopped long ago. He came to a halt before a stained and weathered wall, and from inside his coat, he took out a small object, a silver hair clip darkened by the passing years. The only thing of Nora's that remained, something he had carried with him for all that time. He bent down and placed it upon the cracked concrete step with great care, as though he were laying down a piece of his own heart. It was here, many years earlier, that he had lost his only sister, the gentle girl who had shared the last pieces of bread with him during their hungriest days, the girl who had fallen ill during a brutal winter when they were both too young and too poor to do anything except hold each other and wait for the worst to come. He had no money to take her somewhere decent, no power to open a single door, nothing in his hands except helplessness and empty palms, and that helplessness had followed him for the rest of his life. Nora had slipped away quietly, and on that day, the teenage Cormac had sworn to himself that he would never allow himself to become powerless again, that he would have influence, wealth, and everything poverty had stolen from him. And he had done it. Through all the years that followed, he had built an empire one brick at a time, with the fear he inspired, with an unyielding hardness that showed no mercy, and with a name that made people lower their voices whenever they spoke it. He had gained everything the boy he once was had ever longed for. Yet standing there before that silent wall, he suddenly understood a truth so bitter that it left him numb. None of that power could bring his sister back, erase that fateful night, or fill the emptiness she had left inside his chest. He had spent his entire life gathering strength so he would never be helpless again, and still, he had never managed to save the person he loved. Then, amid those heavy thoughts, Della's image rose in his mind, the young woman who had nothing, no money, no power, not even a roof over her head, and yet had still been willing to give her final coin to a stranger, to share her meager food without calculation or hesitation. She possessed none of the things he had, and yet she carried the very thing he had lost long ago, the ability to give without expecting anything in return, a pure kindness that needed no power to prove its worth. With one small act, she had taught him something an entire empire had never been able to teach. Cormac stood silently in the darkness for a long time, until Silas's voice sounded softly behind him, the loyal right-hand man who had apparently been standing there for some time. "Sir, I need to speak plainly," Silas said, his voice burdened with concern. "That woman is suffering through all of this, partly because she helped you. She's placing her trust in a ragged man named Cor, a man who doesn't exist. The longer you allow her to believe that lie, the deeper the wound will be when the truth finally comes out. Are you protecting her, or are you taking advantage of her trust?" The question struck directly at Cormac's heart because it touched the very conflict he had been trying to avoid for so long. He remained silent, looking down at the silver hair clip resting on the step, and in that moment, he understood that he could no longer remain hidden in the shadows. He had once watched helplessly as one girl slipped away while he could do nothing, and he wouldn't allow another innocent woman to suffer any longer because he was too afraid to face the truth. "You're right, Silas," he finally said, his voice low and resolute. "I've been hiding long enough. I'll tell her who I am. But first, I'll do what I should have done from the beginning. I'll clear her name properly, with truth and evidence, not with power exercised in the darkness. She deserves to be vindicated in the light, and I'll give that back to her." Silas nodded, and for the first time in many years, he saw a light in his employer's eyes that he had believed had gone out long ago, the light of a man beginning to find himself again. That very night, Cormac began setting an entire investigative machine into motion, quietly and methodically, ordering his most trusted people to conduct an independent audit of every stream of money flowing through the Harvest Table organization. He instructed them to preserve every surviving piece of footage from the gala, And more importantly, he assigned a team of specialists to begin recovering the video from the memory card that had been removed, the one he had personally seen Sylvia order someone to erase. He knew that somewhere within those deleted frames lay the truth about the moment Bruno planted the envelope in Della's purse, and if they could restore it, the entire fabricated story would begin to crack apart. Step by step, the links in the operation were traced, the numbers were compared, and the evidence was quietly gathered and stored in a secure place, beyond the reach of anyone inside the organization. Meanwhile, in her luxurious office, Sylvia Renner began to feel an invisible pressure tightening around her. Accounts she had believed were carefully concealed suddenly showed signs of being examined. Several trusted accountants began receiving strange questions, and a vague uneasiness crept into her sleep. Bruno Kessler felt it as well, and one evening, he came to her with worry written across his face. "Someone is digging, ma'am," he said quietly. "I don't know who it is, but they're working with too much precision. This isn't the work of amateurs." Sylvia frowned, tapping her fingers against the desk while possibilities spun rapidly through her mind. She never considered Cormac, because in her eyes, he was still the patron occupied with larger matters, a man who trusted her completely. Instead, she suspected that this was an attack by a rival power trying to seize control of the territory, or worse, the work of federal agencies following the money trail. "Let them dig," she said, her lips curving into a cold, confident smile. "They won't find anything that can reach me." What Bruno didn't know, and what she had carefully hidden even from him, was that Sylvia had long been building secret bridges to an outside power, people strong enough to protect her if the ship began to sink. She had decided that loyalty was merely a luxury for fools, and when the time came, she wouldn't hesitate to change sides, betraying the very man who had raised her up in exchange for a position that was higher and safer. She believed she held every card, that she was always one step ahead of everyone else, and to strengthen her flawless public image, silence every whisper, and affirm her unshakable position, Sylvia decided to organize a major event, a grand community appreciation night where she would proudly receive a prestigious humanitarian award before donors, the media, and the most influential people in the city. She promoted the event everywhere, through newspapers and media outlets, turning it into the center of the city's attention, a stage where she believed she would shine, and every suspicion would disappear. "Once I'm standing on that stage, surrounded by donors and medals," she told Bruno, her eyes glittering with triumph, "there won't be anyone in this world who believes a homeless pregnant girl over me. Reputation, Bruno, is the most powerful weapon there is, and I'm about to have so much of it that no one will dare touch me." At that very moment, an unexpected meeting took place when a mysterious intermediary approached her and delivered a discreet message from an unnamed figure, one final warning that she should stop, withdraw voluntarily, and return what she had taken before it was too late. But Sylvia, consumed by her own arrogance, laughed and refused, never realizing that the offer had come from the very man she was betraying, and that by rejecting it, she had just closed with her own hands the final door of mercy that had remained open to her. Cormac came to see Della on a cold, gray afternoon, and this time he had decided to tell her everything, to cast aside the cloak of deception he had worn for so long. He stood before her, drew a deep breath, and began in a voice burdened with weight. "Della, there's something I have to tell you. I haven't been honest with you from the beginning. The name I gave you, the man you believed I was, none of it was true. My real name is—" But before he could finish, Della gently interrupted him, and what she said left him so stunned that he forgot every word he had prepared. "Cormac Vane," she said calmly, her gray eyes meeting his without the slightest hesitation. "You don't have to pretend anymore. I've known who you are for several days." Cormac stood motionless, his entire body seeming to turn to stone, because in every version of this moment he had imagined, he had never once considered the possibility that she already knew. When did you know?" he stammered, something almost unheard of from a man who was accustomed to controlling every situation. Della gave a faint smile, one that was both sorrowful and perceptive. "The day you took down those two men in a matter of seconds, I was almost certain. No wanderer has hands and eyes like yours. After that, I only had to put a few pieces together. A powerful man suddenly appearing in East Side dressed in rags, a shortened name offered with obvious hesitation, and everything gradually became clear. There aren't many men in this city capable of terrifying others with a single sentence, Mr. Vane." He looked at her, and beneath his astonishment, One burning question rose inside him. If you knew, why didn't you expose me? Why did you stay silent, continue sharing your food with me, and allow me to remain near you? The smile slowly faded from Della's lips, and her expression became grave, carrying a weight that made him lower his head. Because I wanted to see what you would do, she answered. I've met too many powerful people in my life, and I learned that their words aren't worth very much. So I remained silent, and I waited. I waited to see whether you were the kind of man who would stand up and do what was right, or the kind who would quietly walk away when things became inconvenient. I needed to know who you truly were before I decided whether I should trust you. Her words struck directly into Cormac's heart, and in that moment, the most powerful man in the city suddenly felt smaller than he ever had before, a woman who possessed nothing except her integrity. He remained silent for a long time, then began to speak, and for the first time in his life, he told a stranger about the deepest wound he carried. You know, there was once a girl I loved more than my own life, he said softly, his voice tightening with emotion. And I couldn't save her, simply because I had nothing then. I spent the rest of my life building power so I would never be helpless again. But then you appeared, a woman with nothing, and still you gave everything you had to a stranger. You did what my entire empire couldn't do. You reminded me that kindness has never needed power in order to exist. That is why I came back, not to take advantage of you, but because I owe you something I don't know how to repay. Della listened, and although something inside her softened, she didn't rush to forgive him, because the wound caused by his deception was still there. I'm grateful that you saved me, and that you finally told me the truth, even though it came late, she said. But I can't forgive you immediately, Mr. Vane. You watched me give away what I didn't have while knowing far more than you admitted. That hurt me. She paused, rested one hand on her belly, then lifted her head with unwavering resolve. But I will stand up and bring the truth into the light. Not for you, but for justice, for all the people who were abandoned, and for my child. I won't allow the name of a thief to follow my baby and me for the rest of our lives. Community Appreciation Night unfolded inside a magnificent auditorium flooded with light, where the most privileged people in the city gathered beneath crystal chandeliers, and on the stage, Sylvia Renner shone in an elegant gown, savoring every moment of glory she believed she had earned. Just as the humanitarian medal was about to be placed in her hands, she took the microphone, and her gaze suddenly swept toward the back of the auditorium, where Della stood quietly beside her attorney, Marlene, wearing the most presentable clothes she owned, one hand resting on her belly. A triumphant smile appeared on Sylvia's lips, and instead of looking away, she decided to turn Della's presence into a display of her own power. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying throughout the auditorium. How ironic that on the very night we gather to honor compassion, we should be joined by someone who exploited that compassion. The woman standing at the back of this room is the very person who was caught stealing at our charity event. She has come here, perhaps, to continue causing trouble and to tarnish the noble work we are doing. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Della. Whispers began to rise. Phones were lifted once again, and in that moment, the entire auditorium seemed to become the same old courtroom, with her standing as the accused. But this time was different. Della drew a deep breath and stepped forward, one step at a time, her pregnant belly unmistakable amid the sea of elegantly dressed guests. You call me a thief, she said, her voice trembling at first, yet growing steadier with every word. Then let me tell everyone in this room the truth. I have never taken a single cent that didn't belong to me. The envelope found in my purse was placed there by one of your people. The ring found in my car was planted there as well. And as for the meals that were supposed to reach the poor people of this neighborhood, you are the one who knows better than anyone where they truly went. The entire auditorium fell silent, and Sylvia laughed, a cold and contemptuous sound. The accusations of a desperate woman, she said. What evidence do you have? Or are these merely the inventions of a woman trying to salvage a reputation that has already rotted away? In that moment, when everything seemed to be sliding toward despair, when Della had no evidence in her hands that she could present right then, a voice suddenly rang out from the entrance of the auditorium, clear and forceful, though trembling with emotion. She has evidence, and I am a witness. Every eye turned toward the door, and Della could scarcely believe what she was seeing, because the man walking inside was Eddie, gripping the original documents he had once been too afraid to surrender. He moved forward, his face pale but his eyes resolute. I stayed silent for too long because I was afraid, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But during a difficult time, my little girl once received a meal from this program. I can't remain silent any longer when I know that people are stealing the very meals intended for children like my daughter and blaming an innocent mother for it. I have brought every shipping record and every message ordering delivery routes to be changed. The truth is all here." The auditorium erupted into shocked murmurs, and the color began to drain from Sylvia's face. But the most devastating blow was still to come. The great doors of the auditorium opened once more, and a man entered, this time dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his stride carrying an authority that caused the entire room to fall instantly silent. The most powerful guests turned pale, and several hurriedly rose from their seats, because there was no one in their world who didn't know that name. It was Cormac Vane, and when Sylvia's eyes met his face, when she realized that the ragged man from that fateful video and the powerful crime lord now striding toward the stage were the same person, every trace of color drained from her face as she froze in absolute terror. In that instant of terror, she understood the horrifying truth that the man she had secretly betrayed, the empire she had been draining for years, belonged to the very person now standing before her, the man who had witnessed everything with his own eyes. Cormac stopped in the center of the auditorium, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before settling on Sylvia's bloodless face. "The woman you called a thief," he said, his deep voice resounding through the deathly silent room, "gave me the one thing this glittering organization of yours has never possessed: dignity." Cormac gave a slight nod, and on the enormous screen behind the stage, where only moments earlier polished images of charitable work had been displayed, a different video suddenly appeared, footage recovered from the very memory card Sylvia had ordered erased. The entire auditorium held its breath and watched as frame after frame exposed the truth with merciless clarity, showing Bruno Kessler quietly slipping his hand into Della's purse and placing the sealed envelope inside just before loudly accusing her of theft. Horrified gasps echoed throughout the room, and Bruno, standing near a shadowed corner, began to break out in a cold sweat. But it didn't end there. The screen shifted to another recording, this one taken from a security camera at a gas station near the parking lot where Della had been living, clearly showing a stranger sneaking into the old Buick and placing a small object inside on the day before the police discovered the ring. Then Marlene Frost stepped forward with a file in her hands, and her calm but forceful voice carried across the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's one more thing I want everyone here to know. While my client was at the police station, she had the presence of mind to notice an unusual engraving inside the ring that was supposedly stolen and later found in her car. We traced the origin of that engraving, and the result was astonishing. This ring was never stolen as the report claimed. In fact, it never left the possession of the very person who reported it missing, Mrs. Sylvia Renner herself. The trap she set to destroy an innocent woman has turned out to be the very noose she placed around her own neck." Sylvia staggered and clutched the podium, her face drained completely of color. But the final blow, the most devastating of all, was still to come. A member of Cormac's independent audit team stepped forward and presented the findings they had quietly gathered over the previous days. The auditor explained that money flowing through the Harvest Table organization had been systematically drained for years. Charitable donations, meals intended for the poor, all of it diverted through a web of sophisticated schemes. But the most shocking revelation came when the auditor disclosed that the stolen money hadn't merely been funneled into Sylvia's private accounts through shell entities she had created. A portion of it had also been secretly transferred to an outside power, a rival criminal faction seeking to seize control of and overthrow Cormac Vane's empire itself. Sylvia's betrayal wasn't simply theft, it was a conspiracy reaching to the very foundation, a betrayal of the man who had raised her to power. When that truth was laid bare before the entire auditorium, Cormac turned toward her, and there was no explosive rage in his eyes, only a deep coldness far more terrifying than anger. "I gave you a chance to stop," he said quietly, reminding her of the warning she had arrogantly rejected. "You chose this path." In his utter panic, feeling the ground collapse beneath him, Bruno Kessler could no longer maintain control. He stumbled backward, pointed a trembling finger at Sylvia, and blurted out the truth before everyone. "She ordered me to do it. It was all her idea. She told me to plant the envelope, told me to erase the video, told me to hire someone to put the ring in that woman's car. I was only following orders. I was only carrying out what she told me." That accusation was the final drop that shattered everything. And Sylvia Renner, the woman who had always controlled every camera, every story, and every person, now stood frozen at the center of the brilliantly lit stage, watching her entire empire of lies collapse before hundreds of witnesses and countless cameras aimed directly at her. She opened her mouth to deny it, to salvage whatever remained. But there were no words left that could save her, because the truth had been revealed completely beneath the light, leaving her nowhere in the shadows to hide. As Sylvia was escorted from the auditorium amid hushed voices and flashing cameras, people expected Cormac Vane to savor his victory, to stand there with the triumph of a man who had just crushed an enemy. But he didn't. There wasn't a trace of joy on his face, only a heavy, solemn silence, because in that moment, he didn't see victory. He saw only the price so many innocent people had paid for his own blindness. He stepped up to the podium, took the microphone, and to everyone's astonishment, began with a confession no one expected from a man of such power. "I'm not standing here today to claim credit," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I'm standing here to accept responsibility. This organization carries my name and was built under my protection, yet I allowed it to rot from within. I trusted too easily, looked away too often, and became so consumed by my own power that I failed to see the evil growing beneath my shadow. Hungry people were robbed of their meals, generous donors were deceived, and an innocent woman was driven to the edge simply because she dared to show kindness. All of that happened because I failed in my duty. Indifference is also a sin, and that sin belongs to me." The entire auditorium fell silent at those words, because rarely did anyone see a man in his position publicly bow his head and admit his guilt before a crowd. Then he turned toward Della, and his gaze softened. "And to you, Miss Whitmore, I owe an apology before everyone here for all the suffering you endured beneath the name of my organization." Della stepped forward, and when she took the microphone, every eye in the auditorium turned toward her once again. But this time, they were no longer judging her. They were listening. She stood there with one hand resting on her belly, and her voice rang out calmly, carrying a strength that made it impossible for anyone to look away. "I appreciate those words, Mr. Vane," she began, "but there's something I want everyone in this room to understand clearly. That afternoon, when I gave my last money to a ragged, hungry man, I had no idea who he was. To me, he was simply a human being who was hungry, a human being being dragged away like garbage. And my kindness that day was right, not because he later turned out to be powerful, but because it was right from the very moment he was still sitting on the sidewalk in torn clothes." She paused and looked across the auditorium, at the faces of those who had once turned away, who had laughed, who had called her a thief. Had that man remained a poor, nameless stranger forever? Had he never stepped out of those ragged clothes? What you did to him that day, the contempt, the cruelty, the indifference, would still have been just as wrong. A person's dignity isn't measured by the money in their pocket or the power they hold. And I wonder how many of you regret what happened because you truly mistreated a human being, and how many regret it only because that human being turned out to be someone you're afraid to offend. No one answered, because the question had reached the deepest part of every conscience in the room. Della lowered her voice, but every word remained clear and sharp. "For days, the entire world called me a thief. But the truth is that the most honest person is sometimes the one whose name is dragged furthest through the dirt, because honesty threatens those who survive by lying. I have never taken anything that didn't belong to me. The only thing I ever gave away was a little kindness I still managed to keep, even when I had nothing else left." She handed back the microphone, and in the silence that followed, applause began at the back of the auditorium, then spread through the room, growing louder and louder until everyone rose to their feet, not to honor a medal, but to bow before the dignity of a woman they had once tried to destroy. 2 months later, the city had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Sylvia Renner and Bruno Kessler had both come under formal investigation. All their assets had been frozen, and the evidence files had been turned over to the proper authorities to be handled through the full process of law, not through power exercised in darkness, but beneath the clear light of transparent justice. The slanderous video that had once turned the whole world against Della had been removed, and in its place, a public apology had been widely circulated, restoring the clean name she had fought to reclaim with everything she possessed. Della Whitmore had been completely exonerated, but the most precious thing she received wasn't that vindication. It was the tiny life that entered the world, healthy and safe, a baby girl with gray eyes exactly like her mother's. She named her daughter Nora, a name that carried within it an entire story of loss and healing, a quiet bridge joining two lives that had once been crushed beneath the weight of sorrow. Inside a small, warm room with a fireplace and a lovely crib. The very things she had once only dared to dream about, while shivering through freezing nights inside her old car. Della held her daughter close and took out the familiar phone, playing the recording she had protected for so long so that her child could hear the voice of the father she would never meet. This time, when that warm voice filled the room, the tears rolling down Della's cheeks were no longer tears of pain or despair, but tears of peace and happiness, because she knew that the promise she had made during the darkest night of her life had finally been kept. Her daughter would never have to grow up beneath the shadow of a lie. Della's life also entered a new chapter when she was invited to become the Community Transparency Coordinator for the charity program, which had been completely restructured, so that every number was now recorded clearly, and every meal truly reached the hands of the people who needed it. She had transformed her own suffering into a light that guided others. The charity dining area now had a proper shelter to protect people from the rain and sun. And one afternoon, when a ragged man approached hesitantly, a young employee instinctively began to turn him away, but Della gently stopped him. "Please, have a seat," she said with warmth and sincerity. "Every question can wait, but hunger can't." And in that moment, standing at a distance and quietly watching the scene, Cormac Vane understood that the world truly had changed, that kindness had found a firm place within it. That day, he came to her and quietly returned the exact amount of money she had given him on that fateful afternoon on the red carpet, not a cent more, not exaggerated into some grand and dazzling gift, simply the exact measure of what her heart had given away. Della accepted it with a smile, then immediately placed the money into the program's emergency fund so that it could continue its journey, bringing warmth to other people in need. And what remained after everything wasn't the revelation that a ragged beggar had turned out to be a powerful crime lord, because that was only an unexpected twist of fate. The question that should trouble us far more deeply is whether that crowd would ever have felt remorse if the man had remained forever poor, unknown, and powerless. Respect offered only to the powerful is never true respect. It is merely fear dressed in polite clothing. And kindness, real kindness, should never become a lottery ticket we purchase in the hope of being rewarded, because we treat another person with compassion, not because of what they might give us in return, but simply because they are human, and because their hunger, their pain, and their loneliness are real. We help others because, in the moment we give, we also rediscover the most beautiful part of our own humanity. If Della's story has touched your heart, if it has made you pause, even for a moment, and reflect on the meaning of kindness and human dignity, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video with more people so that each day, together, we can continue listening to meaningful stories that move the heart. How do you feel about the story of Della and Cormac, and about their journey from pain to healing? We would be deeply grateful to hear the most sincere thoughts from your heart in the comments below, because every message you share is a precious source of encouragement to us. May everyone listening to this story be blessed with abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Thank you for staying with us until these final words. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.